Good evening, everybody. We're going to start now. My name is Chris Doyle. I'm the director of Caabu, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this event. And it's a very special privilege to welcome Fida Jiryis to Caabu to speak about her fantastic book that she has written. It's a memoir, not just of her own life, but that of her family. Very powerful. There are details on how to purchase the book. It's published by Hearst, and it's a terrific way of actually trying to understand and get insights, powerful insights into the story of Palestinians. And in her experience and that of her father, Sabri Jiryis, who you may very well know, he's a very well-known author, lawyer. He wrote one of the earliest books on the Arabs in Israel. I remember reading that myself. A leading member of the PLO, a confidant of Yasser Arafat himself. It's a memoir that really highlights in all its facets the Palestinian experience, and therefore extremely valuable. So Fida is currently living in Ramallah. She grew up in Lebanon and then Cyprus. Her family came from Fassouta, which is in now northern Israel, quite close to the border with Lebanon. Her writings include several collections of short stories, a contribution to the book Kingdom of Olives, and Ash, Washington Post bestseller. And HaKluv, excuse me, my Hebrew, The Cage, a Hebrew translation of her short stories published this year. So, Stranger in My Own Land, here it is. It describes this journey of her and her family. So, Fida, a very warm welcome and thank you for writing this account, which I much enjoyed. Just to sort of kick off, if you could give us, the reasons why you wrote this book, what motivated you at this stage, and what you were hoping to achieve, in doing so.
Good evening, Chris and everyone. Thank you very much to everyone who is with us tonight, and thank you for hosting me tonight to speak about the book. It's when I began working on this book about 10 years ago, it was as much to try and make sense of our own family story as it was to try and explain the story of Palestine and Palestinian history to friends and to Western readers, particularly after having come back here after a long life in several countries abroad. But perhaps my chief motivation was really wanting to document our my family's somewhat unique story due to my father's work and activism and our unlikely return to our village in Israel after the Oslo Accords. We were among very few people that actually managed to do this. I will give a very brief history to put it in context for our listeners. My father, Sabri Jiryis, was 10 years old at the time of the Nakba. And really Fassouta, our village, is very close to the Lebanese border. It was really the last piece that was occupied when the newly created state of Israel within it. He saw people from neighboring villages actually being expelled during the Nakba, and this left a deep mark on him. He then grew up like the other Palestinian minority that remained in Israel. He grew up under the military rule that Israel immediately put in place against the Palestinians who remained in it. And he eventually graduated from the Hebrew University with a degree in law. And he was one of the leaders of Al-Ard. Al-Ard was the first Palestinian national movement to emerge after the founding of Israel. He was also an ardent Nasserite, and due to his work and activism and trying to realize and advance Palestinian rights, he was heavily hassled in Israel, in and out of administrative detention and house arrest, and all sorts of things that the Palestinians endured. Finally, in 1970, he chose voluntary exile with my late mother, Hanni Shaheen. They went to Beirut, and there he eventually directed the Palestine Research Center of the PLO, and he became an advisor to Yasser Arafat on Israeli affairs. My mother worked in the research center with him. I was born in Beirut, as was my brother, and we stayed there. In 1982, we had the Israeli invasion. I was a young child at the time. And in 1983, the center was targeted by pro-Israel allies, and a big explosion with a car explosion outside it. Several employees and passers-by were killed, including my late mother. A few months after that, in June 83, we moved as a family to Cyprus. We were among the last, Palestinians, certainly, who worked with the PLO to leave Lebanon, and we moved to Cyprus. I grew up in Cyprus. I went to an English school there. I was there for my adolescent years. I went to an English school, and then I went to study in England. And throughout all this time, Palestine was really this dream that we nurtured and lived with. And obviously, due to my father's work, the research center was reopened on a smaller scale in Cyprus. So Palestine was always this dream in my mind and heart, but the idea of us actually going there was unthinkable. We understood that my father was in exile, that going back would be very dangerous, if not impossible. And it was only through a real fluke, after the Oslo Accords were signed, that a very small number of people who worked with the PLO and had held Israeli citizenship before they had left Israel, in other words, they were not refugees, were permitted on a case-by-case basis to submit their papers, to the documents to the Israeli government, and then be able to be allowed back, and that's what we did. So really, in 95, I found myself, out of the blue, returning to Fassouta with my father, my brother, and my stepmother. And thus began really a very difficult journey for me with my history, my personal history, my family history, of trying to find my bearings in Israel and begin my life in my village and in this country. And it's a journey that has unfortunately entailed so much suffering and alienation since then. I stayed in the village for 8 years, and then I left to Canada. At the time, in 2003, I wanted to leave. But in 2009, I returned, and I chose to come to Ramallah in the West Bank, where I've been living since. I've been here for about 14 years now. And I go back and forth to the Galilee to visit my father and my relatives. Stranger in my own land was as much an attempt to tell our own story, my family's story, all of this, traumatic history that we endured as a family, and also to tell the story of Palestine, especially as during my years in England, in Canada, and Cyprus, many of my friends had always told me, we know that there's a problem, but we've never really understood it. We don't really know what the problem is. And I would find myself explaining over and over again. And I wanted to create a kind of one-book account that people would be able to read to understand the basic history of the conflict and what had brought about the dispossession of the Palestinians and the conflict that we live in today. Sorry, you're muted.
It is powerful. I wanted to first of all just talk to you about that early period. I mean, obviously, when Israel came about, as people will know, I mean, the Palestinian areas were under, military control, and so many of the elements that people will be familiar about today in the West Bank were very much instituted, in Palestinian areas in Israel. I think your father was an administrative detainee,
Yes.
for example. And I think at the moment Israel has a highest number of administrative detainees since the occupation began. I mean, give us a little sense, from talking to your family, what that period, was like for Palestinians.
Yes, actually, you're right, Chris, in saying that effectively what Israel did after the 1967 war, it more or less dismantled the system inside Israel, and it moved it to the areas that were newly occupied at the time. But for the first 18 years of its existence, the Palestinian minority who remained in it very much struggled under the system of military rule. To begin with, their villages were grouped into small groups of like 3 or 4 villages. And any movement between various areas, between villages and towns and so on, required a permit from the military governor of each area. So to begin with, in order for people to get to, their work, to school, if they had to leave their villages for any reason, they had to have these permits. These permits were soon used as a method of control to punish people that were deemed, not to be in line, or people who voiced any protest, or, who were deemed to be dissident in any way. And these permits were then withheld as a form of punishment. Also, the military government interfered in everything. Any activities that were held, even social activities in the villages and so on, had to have these permits. People were watched, their movements were constantly watched. The government recruited a large network of informers to spy on people. And it wanted really to give the impression, the military authorities wanted to give the impression that they knew everything, that they knew people's every move. So people were really terrified, in their day-to-day existence of saying or doing anything that might invoke, the wrath of the military governor, because it could mean, being unable to get to their work, or to their school, having certain things revoked from them, really being ostracized within their own communities. They had a very high price to pay. Certainly, people who were involved in any political or intellectual pursuits, especially, to resist the system that they found themselves in, were the first and foremost target of this. In fact, my father's first experience when he went to high school in Nazareth, the bus that was stopped and the policeman climbed on board and asked them, he was 15 at the time, asked him and the few boys who had gone with him for their permits, for their movement permits. And my father told me, he said, I remember, basically I was just, a child, a teenager. And I remember thinking to myself, why do I need a permit to go to school in Nazareth? And in a sense, the repression of the military government really made people grow up very quickly and made Palestinians more aware of their plight. When my father eventually came back in 1904, and eventually 6 months later, we moved back to live here, he once jokingly said to my uncle, he said, I can't really deal with this new reality. I'm here, I'm at home in the village, nobody comes, nobody asks me anything. I can do wherever I want. I can, whatever I want, I can go wherever I want. I don't need permits. I don't need anything. So really, it's a testament to how powerfully this had infiltrated people's psyche and how long they remembered those terrible years, and how hemmed in and prisoners that they felt, really, and under the whim of a military governor who also, by the way, could pass any number of laws or change laws or amend them randomly. In fact, this was done under what was called the emergency or defense regulations, which Israel had inherited from the British Mandate, which in turn had used them to try to quell the Great Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939. At the time, and this is the interesting part, the leading Jewish voices in the country had cried out in protest, against these. But when after the Israeli state was formed, these very same regulations went into effect against the Palestinians in it, and many of the earlier Jewish voices that had condoned them now took part in their implementation. So military rule, if you talk to anybody from, my father's age or slightly younger from that period who still remembers it, people very much are still scarred by it until today, certainly when they talk about it and they relive all those experiences.
And one of the things that struck me was the way, I mean, your family, your father, your uncle were highly active, that
Mhm.
so many of your neighbors were actually worried about that to the extent of almost, not wishing to have anything to do with them at the time. That
Yes.
must have been extraordinary. Uh,
Yes, yes, yes. And in fact, my aunts later told me, they said even suitors, even people, young men who had been interested in my aunts, wanted to approach them for marriage and so on, were turned away by their own relatives, who told them, don't have anything to do with this family, they're only trouble. There's plenty of other girls to marry. So she said, really, there was a point where we would walk in the street and people would avoid saying hello, because they were afraid of being watched and afraid of what would happen to them if they were seen to be mixing with, so-called troublemakers. So really, and this was all done, really, it was all planned. I mean, this wasn't random, because the idea was to put social pressure as well, not just, legal pressure or life pressure, but also social pressure on people from their own communities to deter them from speaking up or organizing any protest against the system. So there were a few, 18 years, really, 18 very dark years. And I think it took, at least one or two generations after that for the effects of that to really wear off. Because what I saw, for example, 15, 20 years ago, the beginnings of the real stirring among young Palestinians in Israel, it was only really after one or two generations had passed since the older generation that still remembered military rule and had been so terrified by it.
And the other thing, this is true, I think there's a much greater confidence amongst Palestinians within Israel now, and, confidence saying that they are Palestinians too, which wasn't always the case.
No.
But the other thing I found interesting was your father's efforts to firstly set up a newspaper, to publish as well, and the obstacles that he faced, but also given the much touted Israel's democracy and so forth, the challenges that he faced in trying to set up a political movement and a political party to get that party registered. Perhaps you might like to outline a little bit of that story.
Yes, yes. Al-Ard was in existence for a few years. I think all in all, no more than 5 or 6 years. And it was a very troubled existence indeed. The movement started out and started recruiting mostly students and laborers and peasants and so on. And very quickly it spread within the ranks of the Palestinians in Israel who felt that they were not somehow sufficiently represented by the Communist Party, which at the time was really the only party that they could hope to join. The others were all the Zionist parties within the Israeli government. When Al-Ard started and it started campaigning for their rights, many Palestinians found their voice in it. And many began to join it. And this greatly irked the authorities, obviously. And they began really a campaign of repression against the movement, really trying to close down every single avenue that the movement was trying to use to attain legitimacy. So the first thing the movement wanted to do was to publish a simple newspaper in order to disseminate its views to the Palestinians, to help it organize people and so on. This was fought very bitterly by the authorities, and eventually they attacked the printing press where it was being printed, and they confiscated the 13th issue, all of it, and they prohibited it from being printed again. The founders then tried to register it as a company and a printing press, essentially, and they felt if we could do that, then we could, the printing press could print our own newspaper. Again, the register of companies refused to give them a license for registration. They went on, they didn't give up, and they tried to register it as a party, a sort of political party, an entity. And they even went so far as to try and run in the Knesset elections in 1965. This was probably their most daring idea. And in the face of this, on the eve of the elections, the government, the police arrested all of the leaders and expelled each of them to remote areas within the country where there were no Palestinians left. My father was expelled to Safed for 3 months under military orders, of course. He had to report to the police 2 or 3 times a day. So essentially, he couldn't leave Safed. And the
Safed,
others
of
were
course,
expelled.
Palestine free? I mean, there were no Palestinians really in Safed at the time, I think.
No. He said, in fact, he said, he would walk around and see their houses that had been deserted. And he said it was really 3 of the most depressing months of my life, just witnessing, this emptiness and the new immigrants that had come in to take their place. And so, they remained basically under internal expulsion until the elections were over. And after that, the Minister of Interior declared Al-Ard an illegal organization. So they basically just completely, ended the movement. And even within that short frame of time, its disputes had reached the Supreme Court, I believe, 6 times, something like that. But in the end, to no avail. I mean, it was completely crushed. And I think it would take something like 20 years for another Palestinian party to eventually make its way to the Knesset.
Then, of course, you were born in Lebanon, and you have, you grew up in exile, of course. What do you recall of that time in Lebanon? I mean, you were born at the time, really, of the Civil War, and of course the Israeli invasion. What are your recollections?
My recollections from Beirut are mixed. The early years, obviously, I was a young child. Those memories generally are happy. My mother and my father tried to create a happy home life for us, especially because, they felt sorry for us that we were missing our extended family, which is such an important part or feature of Arab life and of Palestinian life. They tried in Beirut to give us the best life possible. We were very lucky, of course, that we didn't live in the refugee camps. We lived in Beirut proper. And they tried to, my mother paid great attention to our schooling, to our toys. We had friends who worked with my father in the center, and they would come over and so on. My last years in Lebanon, meaning, let's say, from about age 7 until 10, when we left, those last 3 years were extremely traumatic for me, because even as a young child at that age, I remember the Civil War, and I remember the Israeli invasion, and I remember the absolute sense of terror that the adults lived in all the time, and that no matter, obviously, how much they tried to hide, filtered onto us children. I remember, the endless days of running from one house to another, running from the Israeli shelling, running from the intermittent bombing everywhere, the smell of burning tires that filled the city, the stench sometimes of corpses that could not be removed on time. I mean, Beirut really, really turned into a hellhole. And to witness that as a small child, I think until today, there are certain parts of my psyche that are maybe inaccessible even to me, because as a young child, there was simply no way to make sense of everything that was happening around me. Beirut really was a trauma. It was a huge trauma, Chris. And I think even until today, I still speak to friends and to friends of my parents who lived with us there during that time. And I can safely say, and the Palestinians also, other Palestinians will say, I don't think any of us left Beirut a completely normal person. I think normality in our own psychology, in our own view of the world was gone from that point, because it was just so utterly horrific. With the loss of my mother, really, I mean, it culminated there. And, we left the country, we were really in shambles. My little family was really in shambles. And Cyprus really opened its arms to us and welcomed us into a safe haven. And for that, I will always be grateful. No Arab country would take us, incidentally. Cyprus opened its doors, and the PLO cultural institutions moved there after Beirut.
And then, of course, fast forwarding quite a few years, you're able to go to Palestine, and I suppose
Yes.
this is where we get the title of your book. That you were a stranger, which of course is a weird thing. I mean, you're in this extraordinary situation, as you said, that few Palestinians have experienced, of return actually, to within Israel. I mean,
Yes.
how did this manifest itself, this feeling of not being, really a part of your own country, not really belonging? I mean, that's must be very tough to handle.
Yes, it was especially if you had spent your whole life dreaming and thinking about this country. And for, your expectations are sky high. Because in my mind, I was coming back to Palestine, and this is the place that, we had dreamt of for so long. This is the place that we had made huge personal and family sacrifices for. My father had dedicated his life to working for this place, and we were finally, against all odds, able to come back. So you can sense how big the sense of expectation was, that this return was finally happening. In fact, when we landed on our way to the village from the airport, about 10 or 15 minutes before we reached the village, I kept piping up along the journey to ask my father how far we still had to go. And finally, he turned around and he said, it was past midnight at that point, and he said, in about 10 minutes, we should be in the village. And I just burst into tears. I mean, that was how emotionally charged our return was. I came back, and really we were welcomed into this monsoon almost of love from our relatives. They had never, ever expected that they would ever see us among them, And so this was huge for them, that we were finally able to return and everything. My first visit was like that. It was really on cloud nine. It was, being engulfed in this tide of love, and in this, extreme sense of finally belonging somewhere, walking around the village streets, trying, my own personal journey to retrace my mother's footsteps, being in my grandmother's house where my mother as a young child grew up, even seeing some of the furniture that was still there, amazingly, all that time later. It was very much a personal journey for me as well. And then we went back to Cyprus for a while, and 6 months later, in June 95, was when we made the return for good, the final return. And this was an entirely different chapter. It was during this chapter that I had my rude awakening, that, I suddenly acquired an Israeli ID. I acquired an Israeli passport. Not knowing Hebrew quickly became a problem. I had to teach myself at least basic Hebrew, otherwise I would be severely constrained in trying to find work. And as you can appreciate, I mean, I'm doing all this against having to fight my own psychological, almost kicking and screaming, this refusal to deal with Israel or with the Israeli state, and my horror, at getting on buses and seeing Israeli soldiers and, beginning to figure out this military ethos and this undercurrent of violence that spanned everything in the country. And that was unlike anything I had experienced before. This was another problem for me, that my relatives, my cousins in Fassouta, had been born and grew up there. They didn't know any other system. So they were acclimatized to the life they lived, and they didn't really think anything of it. This was all they knew. For me, because I was making the comparison with other countries I had lived in and grown up in, this horror was completely unacceptable. And it was equally difficult for me because I couldn't really talk to anyone about it. There was nobody that would really understand why I am really so unable to integrate and why I'm finding it so difficult on every level. And it continued. I mean, I really felt, what I called it at the time when I eventually started to make sense of it was social schizophrenia. This is what I felt. And in fact, the title of this book, Stranger in My Own Land, is shockingly how I have felt and how I still feel 27 years after coming back to this country.
It's extraordinary. And I think some of the most powerful moments of the book, or illuminating, is when you were working and interacting with Israeli Jewish neighbors or co-workers, and the sheer gulf in terms of your experience and theirs, barely the two parties understanding each other at all. It seems a very weird relationships, given you live in the same country.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And in fact, this was something that I found to be extremely sad, and I still do. We live very, very segregated lives in the state, and it's done that way by design. By design from the Israeli state. I mean, generally, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis live in different places. So even physically, we don't really live in the same place, with the exception of the few so-called mixed cities. But the communities are separate between the Palestinian and the Jewish communities. There's very little intermingling. I mean, yes, you have, the friendships and you have relationships and so on, but really, if you take them as a percentage out of the whole population, there's really very little. Certainly in my own experience going to work in Israeli workplaces, I have never felt so alienated anywhere. In fact, I felt like I was accepted as a foreigner and even loved and taken in other countries where I was, such as Canada, such as the UK, Cyprus, even Qatar that I worked in briefly. In all these countries, I felt, of course, there is an implicit sense of, I should say, racism in all communities in the world, in all societies and so on. Not even racism, but sometimes just fear of the other or apprehension or so on. But in Israel, it was so marked, it was so in my face. It was clear that there was no way I was ever going to belong with these people, and that they didn't want it and they couldn't accept it, and that I was simply a living, breathing problem. This was accentuated by the fact that, with my bad luck, it so happened that in the 2 or 3 places I worked in Israel, I was the only Palestinian among between 30 to 60 Jewish Israeli employees. So you can imagine the sense of loneliness and trepidation and apprehension that I felt every day going into work. I was so utterly alone. Having said that, there were a few people that I met along the way, and I struck up friendships and we began to talk. But there was another rude shock waiting for me, which is that eventually, as soon as there would be any clashes or any skirmishes or any problems in the country, including, obviously the time of the Second Intifada and so on, these relationships would very, very quickly run into very muddy waters, and they would end soon afterwards, because the Israelis were simply not ready to listen to me or to my narrative or to my story. The responses were very painful. When I tried to open up to people, they ranged from apathy, not really wanting to listen, perhaps it was a defense mechanism, to, in a more extreme case, to being told, Fida, I think, you really need psychological therapy. You're messed up. Something is wrong. You have too many anger issues. You need to go and talk to someone about them. So, I mean, again, perhaps not so surprising, because I can, since then, having grown so much more, let's say, savvy with what's going on in the country and having a much deeper awareness of this dynamic, I can understand also the Israeli unwillingness to face up to this, because it's truly horrific. To really face up to what has been done to the Palestinian people is no simple feat.
And I think there was also one occasion about one of your co-workers, coming to visit you in your own home. What was that like? Give us an insight to that.
That was probably one of the weirdest lunch invitations I ever gave to anyone. The background was that she told me, I was working with her. She was a British lady, quite a bit older than me at the time. I mean, I was probably about her daughter's age. She had immigrated she's Jewish, and she had immigrated to Israel as a young girl and married a local Israeli and stayed here. And we became friends. I had studied in England. We appreciated British humor, my English and so on. So we really became friends. And one day, she showed up at the office and she said, I'm very nervous going home. She lived in a nearby kibbutz. And she said, some Arabs have been throwing stones at the cars as I pass. And I noticed, it struck that she said Arabs. Nobody would, no Israeli would say Palestinians about the Palestinians living in Israel. And so I told her, well, Lisa, why are they throwing stones? She said, well, they were working in the kibbutz and they were thrown out. I said, why, did they do something? And she said, no, but some people just don't want Arabs working at the kibbutz. And it was something about just the matter-of-fact way in which it was said that was really, it was really almost like a knife. It was just said like, this is normal, this, like we say, oh, it's a cloudy day today. People don't want Arabs working at the kibbutz. It's normal, And so I decided, I was so upset And I went home and I was really upset and I kept thinking about it. And eventually I decided to invite her and her husband to my home for lunch. And it was probably the most awkward meal I've ever had in my life. I mean, every topic, I thought to myself, well, the husband, was very cold and very aloof. And I thought, well, he'll warm up soon enough, So every topic I tried to start conversation, ended very abruptly. They really ate as quickly as they could. They thanked me and they got up to leave. And I just cleared away the plates afterwards thinking, what was that? And the next day she told me at work, she actually apologized and she said, Fida, I'm really sorry, but my husband served in a high rank in the Israeli army and we should not have done this. He was very uncomfortable visiting an Arab home.
Quite remarkable. For those who'd like to ask Fida a question about the book, please do put down your question in the chat. I wanted to now just take you to something very political. You would have seen, of course, all the varying human rights groups, Palestinian, Israeli, and now international, who have determined that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in your experience, living in Fassouta, do you feel that systematic discrimination, that that level of discrimination that you, your family, and others experienced met that term, and you're a lawyer, of the crime of apartheid?
I think to go back to a little bit at the beginning to the foundational principles of Israel, because I think it's always necessary to remember those and to examine those in order for one to understand the present context. Israel was built, the notion of Israel is this so-called homeland for the Jewish people. Once you've defined it like that, you've automatically excluded everybody who happens to be non-Jewish. When you then take that and you translate it into practices on the ground in order that would, align with this principle, those practices would automatically translate into some form of apartheid. Why? Because automatically you are discriminating against people based on ethnic origin or based on religious belief. Now, when we speak about apartheid and discrimination, often these days, I get this argument, they say, but the Palestinians in Israel, they are now professionals and they hold, excellent positions. And yes, that's true, they do. However, you have to dig a little deeper. Certainly in my time, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was looking for a job, having an army number was a prerequisite. They ask you for your army number. Now, as Palestinians living in Israel, we're exempt from the army. Very few of us join it. But a lot of Israeli workplaces that I applied to asked me for my army number, and if I didn't provide it, they wouldn't call me back for the second interview. Essentially, this is a way of keeping you out of jobs without telling you outright that it's because you're not Jewish. Now, so many, tens or even hundreds of Jewish communities have been built, new ones, since the establishment of the State of Israel. Not one single Arab community, a new one, has been built inside the State of Israel, even though Palestinian localities all suffer from unbelievable overcrowding and the desperate need to increase their building space. The budgets, the state budgets that are given for development, for business initiatives and so on, compare those in the Arab areas with the Jewish areas, and you immediately see the huge discrepancy. The policy by the state to always break up, and this was, one of its founding fathers' sort of principles, to always break up so-called concentrations of Palestinians by dotting Jewish settlements and communities in the middle of Palestinian villages and, in between and so on. So, the nervousness that you feel even today, the nervousness that you feel in speaking Arabic, for example, in public in Israel, I certainly feel that nervousness. And many times I will see when I'm out with my friends or relatives, when we are in a public place and we're speaking Arabic, if we suddenly, go into a mall, or if we are surrounded by Israelis at a close proximity, I don't think we're aware of it even, but certainly in my circle, our voices would drop. Our voices would subconsciously drop. We're trying to be, not too visible. We're trying not to attract too much attention. So really, it's your feeling, yes, it's your feeling, you're either Jewish and therefore one of the privileged ones and one that has complete rights in the state, or you are a Palestinian. If you're inside Israel, you should really be thankful that you're allowed to stay on your land and that you're somehow tolerated. This is the attitude of the state. And every time, we speak about discrimination and so on, all hell breaks loose. In the West Bank, the situation, of course, is hundreds of times worse because we are living with them, under a system of outright military occupation and dispossession that continues every single day. The Nakba has not ended. It is alive and well. And we are seeing more displacement, more dispossession, and more violence against Palestinians every single day.
And it's very painful to watch that. And I would say that your book is really an excellent guide as to the journey one needs to take in order to understand how this system of apartheid has come about, within Israel. I think I often say we take, as you know, delegations of members of parliament to Palestine. They go to the occupied territory. They start understanding that. It's almost like the next grade up
Yes.
if they start to understand the situation for Palestinians within Israel. I think that area is widely misunderstood, including in the Arab world, actually.
Yes.
I would suggest as well there is little understanding of that. I'm very keen for audience participants, if you have any questions, to put them to Fida. If I don't see any, I have plenty more, and we can continue chatting for ages. I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you something really about the present day as well, and yet again focusing a little bit in 48. Everybody will have been reading about the latest Israeli coalition. And of course, at the extremist of the extreme end of that coalition, with people like Ben Gvir, Smotrich. I mean, how are your family, your friends, Palestinian friends in Israel, finding this now? There's talk about, creating militias, within Israel to stop. Of course, there's this law they're putting through about which could, in theory, legalize another route to cancel Palestinian citizenship of Israel. I mean, how are they finding this climate right now? It must be very intimidating once again.
It is, Chris, it is. And I think one of the things my father once told me when we were in discussion, and it took me a while to get around this, but I realized, what, he has a point. He said to me, Israel's actions towards the Palestinians have conversely or perversely actually helped the Palestinian cause stay alive. In other words, with the growing repression against the Palestinians inside Israel, even those who had sort of, just learned to kind of, keep a low profile and move on and not really, and, as people like to say, I'm not involved in politics, now find themselves suddenly, with all of this heat around them, and find themselves again a target. If there were a few years here and there where people could comfortably forget that and sort of assume that, if they just lay low, keep a low profile, get on with their work, not really get involved in any protest or any politics or so on, then, life would just go on normally. Now, I think more and more Palestinians are feeling, certainly those inside Israel, that this citizenship that they have is a very, very skewed one, and that actually it is very far from the normal concept of citizenship that you would feel in any other country, which by definition implies equality, implies rights, implies, certain protections from, let's say, any form of state terror, or, certainly in advanced countries and so on in the West. But now people are feeling, okay, so I hold this citizenship, but I'm not really a citizen here. I'm not a full citizen. I'm not treated as such. Every few years, the government comes up with all of these schemes for how to deal with us being the problem. What this is doing also, because the Palestinians in Israel are seeing and following closely what's going on inside the West Bank, together with this new repressive measures that Israel is now talking about against the Palestinian citizens of Israel, there is a new kind of affirmation coming about between the two groups. And certainly in my experience and from talking to people, there is a growing awareness also that we are one people. That, these decades of severing us through the separation wall and through 1948 and 1967 and different IDs and all of this complex and horrific system that Israel has created to separate human beings, it's almost like all of that now is crumbling because Palestinians are inside Israel are seeing themselves really as the brethren of those here. And they are very, very aware of what's going on in the West Bank. And they are starting to feel that they too are a target because of this new government. Having said that, I should go back a few years also, and even under the previous governments, there was something I saw that, really warmed my heart over the last decade or 15 years or so. As you said, there were more people speaking up inside Israel and saying, we are Palestinians. They are having demonstrations. They are raising the Palestinian flag. They're expressing support with their brethren under direct Israeli occupation. This was not the case when I came about 30 years ago. This was not the case. There were obviously demonstrations here and there and things here and there, but today, because everybody feels that they are a target, so this sense of unity among people and this sense of cohesiveness and this new realization of themselves as Palestinians is re-emerging.
Well, we now have a number of questions, so we're going to take a few. Chris Hayden has got a question. Chris, are you with us? Maybe not, but it's a simple one, really easy answer. Is there any reason for optimism of a positive, albeit eventual outcome? Any sign of optimism? Maybe your last answer was that.
Yes, I suppose optimism also, there are certain things that we Palestinians, certainly those of us living here, try to hold on to. Otherwise, we would all, pack it in and go completely crazy. One of these things, in my own personal feeling, is both the numbers of Israelis, albeit small, who do understand what's going on and who, are trying to work, join organizations, join protest movements and so on to end the occupation, to speak up about Palestinian rights and so on. Finding these organizations for me and working with these individuals goes a very long way towards feeling that at least, it's not everybody, that at least there are people who understand, there are people who see the injustice of it and who are trying to work against it. Certainly the growing international support, if not at the official state level or government levels of, the Western countries, certainly of the people, of the NGOs, the organizations and so on. In Ramallah over the last few years, I've witnessed an incredible, phenomenal number of delegations and people that have come. People are more aware, they know what's going on. The Jewish American community is another one where I feel a lot of hope because there are more and more people, again, coming on board, asking the right questions, refusing to stick to what they were told possibly as they were, growing up, with Zionist backgrounds and so on. I try to hold on to all this. The more pessimistic among us will say, well, all of this support isn't really translating into anything. We're not really cashing in on any serious or fundamental decisions by the Western countries, the supporters of Israel. But, as I said, we're trying right now to hold on to every thread. Sadly, though, I will say today, if you talk to Palestinians, I don't think anyone feels any hope anywhere. The only thing perhaps that we think of a sort of Armageddon scenario, in the sense that if it gets really, really, really bad as it is at the moment, in a reverse psychology kind of way, that will force the world to sit up and to pay more attention, to take more action. Again, nobody knows.
And we have a question from Professor Ian Scoby. Ian, welcome. You've got a question.
Yes, sorry, I'm a lawyer, and this is a legal question. It's about the proposed restrictions that the current Israeli government wants to put on the Supreme Court, where, as far as I can gather, there could be votes in the Knesset to overturn Supreme Court decisions. One of the things that the Israeli government has always done has been hiding behind the Supreme Court, saying that our actions are subject to judicial review, they must be legitimate.
Yes.
If these changes go through, does that remove that veneer of legitimacy?
Yes, and in fact, this is something that, it's surprising in that sense. I mean, I think all of us certainly are, shocked, if you like, at the degree to which there seems to be a complete disregard, even for, basic, tenets of democracy and the legal system and the judiciary and so on. Certainly, when we look at the proposed changes and so on, it's absolutely correct what you said. They would pass the most, horrendous laws and so on, and then say, well, the Supreme Court ruled on it. And this has certainly been a very painful experience with Palestinians. And in fact, most of the expropriation of Palestinian land ultimately took place like this, because ultimately the Supreme Court was the final body to resort to, and it would always overturn the Palestinians. And so, yes, I mean, really, most of us are just in shock that even this, they don't care. They just, they will do away with everything and anything that stands in the way of achieving what they want to achieve. And this is the particularly dangerous downward spiral particularly for Jewish Israelis. Again, for Palestinians, this, if you look at it really for Palestinians, it's really more of the same. Having the Supreme Court in place has not really resulted in a tangible improvement for the Palestinians, for their situation. So it's it's something that you look at and you think, yes, in terms of democracy in Israel, it's a big disaster. But in terms of the relation to the Palestinians, it's a much, much bigger question. It's the whole question of the whole system, the whole apartheid system in place, the whole governmental attitude towards Palestinians in the West Bank and those in Israel itself.
And we have a question from Vivkin Ross, who's watching on YouTube, and he's interested in your take on the future of the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, you're living in Ramallah at the moment. Does it still have a mandate to govern, he asks, or will it soon become irrelevant? Perhaps, in your view, it's become irrelevant already.
It has certainly become irrelevant. What used to be said among Palestinians in hushed tones up until a few years ago is now being said openly and publicly and written and spoken about everywhere. Palestinians have had about just as much as they can take, really. And it's openly said that the Palestinian Authority is no more than an agent for the Israeli occupation, which is really a horrific state of events to find ourselves in. The Palestinian Authority engages in security coordination with Israel. It passes along, it will hand over young Palestinian men and those working in the resistance and so on. This has been long known. And it's really, it really is Israel's agent on the ground to make sure that, Israel's agenda remains in place. The situation, though, is particularly acute and hopeless because Palestinians feel that even if the Palestinians themselves succeed in trying to change it, trying to topple it, trying to change it, going to elections and so on, Israel will not let that happen. And so we really feel like we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. There is a real sense of despair because people are saying, okay, even if the current PA goes, what will come will be something similar. It's a very, very bleak situation. And as far as legitimacy, I mean, Palestinians here simply don't take it seriously anymore. Nobody waits for anything that the PA says after any disturbance or operation. Certainly after all this violence the Palestinians have witnessed. I myself, like many other Palestinians, struggle with a huge degree of rage that I feel, like what happened in Hawara, when, people were violently and horrifically attacked, and the so-called PA, which is the so-called government, quote unquote, of these areas could not lift a finger to help. That in itself really speaks volumes.
Thank you for that. Now, I've got a question from Sally Lovett. Sally, are you there? Well, her camera's not on, so I'm going to ask it myself. She wanted to ask already, but she remembers the original Meir Kahane, of course, Rabbi Meir Kahane, who is essentially the ideological godfather of Ben Gvir and his ilk. That used to be very much on the periphery of Israeli society during his lifetime. How do you see the future now his followers have taken center stage and hold key posts in the government? I mean, I suppose this is a little bit what we've covered, but I mean, do you see this as a blip? I mean, do you see this as, this move to the extremes of the Israeli right? Do you see that this is something that's going to last? Do you see this Israeli coalition actually lasting itself? I think there must be some doubt about that.
There is certainly doubt about it, and certainly not to do so much with the Palestinians. As such, we are not really a key player in anything, I think, in Israeli politics. That's the sad but undeniable truth. I think the current fight currently taking place in Israel is within Israel itself. Jewish Israelis themselves are worried about, losing the tenets of democracy and worried about where this new government is taking the country. But certainly very few of them are losing sleep over the fact that the Palestinians are, under an even more violent, onslaught than they were before. There is one thing that I'm always careful to point out to people, which is that under the previous Israeli governments, from a Palestinian viewpoint, there wasn't really a very big difference. In other words, the previous governments that were, before this one, certainly, the settlement project in the West Bank, the continuing dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians, the house demolitions, the terrible restrictions on movements, the prevention of thousands of people from entry, even, to rejoin their families, the stealing of water and land and natural resources. All of this was taking place under each and every successive Israeli government. The fact that we're now seeing it done in a more violent way or more blatantly or more in our face doesn't mean that under the previous governments everything was okay. From a Palestinian viewpoint, I myself am not at all surprised, because having gleaned as much as I do about Israeli society and this hotbed of violence that simmers in every single aspect of the society, to me, this was not at all surprising where we arrived today. And in fact, to many other Palestinians, this was not surprising. Whether this will continue, whether it will just continue picking up steam like some kind of mad train, or whether eventually it will be curtailed, nobody really knows at this point. Everybody obviously is hoping. But I, as Fida, don't really have a lot of hope for other governments coming in that are suddenly going to, I'm speaking from, my own Palestinian viewpoint, that are suddenly going to realize that, we are really doing terrible things to the Palestinian people, and this has got to stop.
We have one final question from Bill De Kaiser. Bill, I can see you on the screen.
Hi, Fida.
Hi, Bill.
I just thought about the recent deportation of this French lawyer, a human rights lawyer, and was concerned about how Palestinians feel about themselves. He had been born in Jerusalem. There's no real reason to deport him. Does this mean that every Palestinian is in danger of being deported?
This is the case of Salah Hamouri, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah. Fida.
Yes. We are feeling extremely insecure, all of us. In fact, I will share, I have a friend, a journalist, a Palestinian who lives in Israel. I don't want to share her name here, but she's, a well-known journalist, and she's very vocal. And she's been absolutely, terrified over the last few weeks, months, and so on. And she actually tells me, she says that she has very difficult and pained conversations with her husband, trying to work out what they would do if there was a sudden revocation of her, Israeli citizenship. And this is someone with Israeli citizenship, not even, a Jerusalem or West Bank. So this is supposedly, the top in terms of, having a secure citizenship in the system. And she said, we discuss it all the time. She has 2 young girls, and she says, where do I go? I don't really have another citizenship. What happens if that scenario actually plays out? Certainly people here in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, are very nervous, very, very nervous. I know that some people are practicing, self-censorship lately, that they are scared. Sometimes I will share, even personally, I'm looking at things on social media, and sometimes for a second I'm wondering if I can comment on something or if I can say something freely. And you do think about it. You very much think about it, because it seems to stop at, no boundaries here. And over the next year or so, we're really expecting things to just keep getting worse and worse. My Israeli friends, by the way, certainly the ones that I'm in touch with about all of this, and we speak about all of this, are equally depressed about this whole situation. So yeah, Palestinians are extremely nervous and insecure.
Well, I think that we've run out of time, which is a great pity, because it's been wonderful talking to you this evening, Fida, to
Thank you.
discuss this wonderful memoir. It really is terrific. Joe has very kindly, my colleague Joseph Willits, put the link to the book in the chat. So do go out and purchase it, buy it for your friends, and I think you will find it very stimulating. And for those who haven't, do please join Caabu as a member. We'd love to have you as members. Joe's also put the link to join as a member. We will have other meetings such as this, of course, coming up, and we're busily raising many of these issues within Parliament. This is clearly a matter of great concern to us. But for that, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all our participants tonight for your questions and for listening. And wish you all a very, well, everyone in Palestine safety, and I hope you're going to be okay for that in Ramallah. It's obviously very grim times. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for